if we'll go back just quickly, just catch this up. I said you don't have to do it my way, but if I had enough time, like maybe a normal conversation with someone I knew, and they said, why are you a Christian? I say, well, there's three things. I think of it as three layers of probability. And remember, the first is quite probable, very probable, virtually certain. This doesn't have to be your way, it's just how I think about it. And that quite probable, I said, there are facts about reality that sure seem to me to point toward the existence of a God. And so I said, I think it was 10 things, and you could list more, but at least 10 things where I think God is the best explanation. So I think it's quite probable, at least God exists. That doesn't mean Christianity is true. It could be any God that is all-powerful creator. So you can't get Christianity based on arguments from the universe began. That doesn't get you to Jesus, for crying out loud. But it does make it quite probable to me that God does exist. When we get to the second layer is very probable. And the very probable is where we get to something I call external internal criteria. And then the third would be virtually certain. There are two major criteria aspects or levels of data when I do history, and most historians do think this way. So we ask the question, what makes something likely to have happened? Likely to have happened. And there are two things that really help. One is there good, sufficient, external evidence or data? And that would be things such as, is there a good manuscript tradition? Are there archaeological records of it? That includes coins, numismatics, what that means, drawings, paintings, potsherds, structures, buildings, houses. Is there anything at all that can corroborate it? Those are things that would be external. Then the second thing would be internal. When we look at the stories or the actual narrative or the words, the languages, do the stories, do they ring plausible for that environment? If they talk about unicorns and everyone rides on a rainbow, it seems very implausible, especially we know about how nature works and science works. But if at that time period in that region it seems probable, then it is more probable. Secondly, can the internal evidence be corroborated outside? Did anybody else in that time period, whether Native Americans, any other time, did they write about something, the same thing that someone else wrote about? Can it be corroborated whatsoever? And of course, corroborate just means compared, joined with something else. And my son goes, I didn't leave those dirty dishes. And Julia goes, he didn't. It was our neighbor. Well, she corroborated that testimony. Now, they may be in cahoots, and they're lying both. But it is more likely, if my kids do tell the truth, that they're telling the truth if she goes, really, really? So those are two things I do in anything. And so to show I'm being consistent, when I basically left the faith twice, I applied the same criteria to different world religions and philosophies. And I found them wanting, which is why I eventually ended up staying with Christianity. For example, Mormonism. If you look at the Book of Mormon. So the Book of Mormon comes from a guy named Joseph Smith. I'm going to say this very briefly, but this is a perfect example of trying to be consistent. Joseph Smith supposedly met father, son, father who's a creature. The father was a human who eventually became a god. Jesus, who's a creature, of course. And then all people can be divine themselves. But anyway, the angel Moroni meets them and reveals these golden tablets or tablets of gold. We don't know if they just glowed gold or they were made of gold. He translates them into what's called reformed hieroglyphics. And it tells the story of, and I'll tell you about that in a little bit. Anyway, it tells stories. Well, the Book of Mormon supposedly had between 8 to 11 or ish witnesses who saw the golden tablets. And apparently, even to their deathbed, they said they saw it, even though 2 or 3 of them were excommunicated from the church, and then some of them came back in later on from the fold. Apparently, they never recanted. So they have witnesses and first-hand testimony, supposedly have seen it. What do we do about that? So we have manuscript tradition that's pretty good because it's not that long ago. This is 19th century. And then we have internal evidence of people who said they saw the golden tablets and Joseph Smith really is a prophet. Well, it kind of sounds like the New Testament when we say there's manuscript tradition, thank you, and there is internal witness. When I apply the same thing to the Book of Mormon, that's where I had huge problems. Huge problems. For example, when you look inside the narrative, it's particularly the internal data. Inside the internal data, there is zero corroboration of the tribe of Nephi. It's called, the tribe of Nephi. It can't be corroborated anywhere. There's no corroboration of the reformed hieroglyphics anywhere that we can find at all. The locations used aren't corroborated. There's numerous details in the story of this lost tribe of Israel, tribe of Nephi, that came over from Israel and so forth, that cannot be corroborated. They say there were horses here, chickens here, chariots, elephants, steelworks, none of those things existed before the Spanish brought them, most of them, centuries later. And so there's zero archaeological evidence for any of this. There's zero archaeological evidence for, I think I already said, but the language itself. So these become very problematic. So even if someone says, I swear I saw it, but then you read the story and there's zero corroboration, that's to me, that's unfortunate. And there's a guy who's considered one of the leading American archaeologists of our generation, and I think he now works at Yale, kind of retired, he's a specialist, Michael Coe. He says, let me now state uncategorically that as far as I know, there is not one professionally trained archaeologist who is not a Mormon who sees any scientific justification for believing that the Book of Mormon's statements concerning archaeology to be true. And I'd like to state that there are quite a few Mormon archaeologists who join this group. This is in spite of a host of well-intentioned books and articles by Mormon intellectuals trying to justify these claims. So what typically Mormons do will say the Mayans, the Mesoamericans, they are the ancestors of this original tribe, and some of the language we find there is just how, Reformed Egyptian and so forth. It's just the problem is everybody else who's not Mormon isn't convinced, and all the literature. Now that doesn't mean therefore they're wrong. It just means, for me, makes it very improbable when there's zero corroboration, not to mention other the hard data like steel and chariots and whatever. So I'm just saying that's the external and internal corroboration. We can do other examples if you want, but I want to move on. Do you have any questions or comments about that? If a Mormon apologist, he or she be right here and go, no. But I've done a good bit of research, so not tons. I'm not a Mormon specialist, but I've done a good bit of research on this, and that's one reason I'm not a Mormon. When I go to the New Testament and apply the exact same criteria, I find certain things. Okay, let's look at what I call very probable. Number one, the manuscripts we have of the New Testament in particular are very ancient. Now, let me pause here and explain what these things mean. A manuscript, this is a copy of P45, well, a sheet from P45, and I can just pass that around. And papyrus comes from papyrus plant. It grows in shallow waters, particularly in Egypt near the Nile. And they would take it off like you shuck a corn. I always want to say shuck a corn. Anyway, you shuck it. You pull the leaf apart, and when you pull apart it excretes this kind of a natural glue. And you take all the sheets apart, you crisscross it. So you lay them straight, you get them real wet, you get them straight, you put them a little bit on top of each other, and then you do crisscross. And then you get it really hot. A lot of times they'll put it on a big flat rocks, and it bakes it, and it comes out kind of wobbly and malleable, and you write on it.
It's like lattice woven.
Kind of, sort of woven. No, it's not necessarily woven, but it's like that. Layers. It's more like layers. That's right. And if you look at this picture, this is a picture of P52. Can you see the grains there? See those grooves that go left to right? And right here, you can see the vertical? Right there. Up, down, up, down, up, down. And some that you might be able to see in that picture as well in P45. And this was not the only, but the dominant way the ancient world and the Western world used it. Now, the Chinese did as well, but that's a different story. They could use vellum and leather and all kinds of stuff, but this was the most popular. It was a little pricey, but it was one of the cheapest of the options. And it was great. It lasted for a while, unless it had heavy usage. If it got too wet, it could get that worn out. To save money, they would take papyrus they might find in the trash dump, and they would scratch. You don't erase it; you scratch it off with a little knife. There's a little tool they could scratch it off, and they would use it again. They write on top of it. They're on the edges. That's called a palimpsest, and we have New Testament manuscripts just like that. They took old stuff and scratched over it and wrote a New Testament gospel or something. If they write on both sides of the document, that didn't happen all the time, but when they did, that's called an apostograph, or apostrophe from the Greek for back of the hand. So apostograph is when you use both sides. And the early Christians either invented or really, really made popular the codex. And those who had my class on this knows what I'm talking about now on how to read the Bible. This is a codex, what we call a book. Codex is, of course, when you take the sheets. There's about 3 or 4 major ways to do a book. If you rip this apart, you know how binding goes. You do a group at a time and you sew it, or you can glue it and do another little, you get another pack and you sew those, another pack and sew those, and then you bind the bottom. It's called a codex. Well, that was an invention in the first century. Romans used what we call a book scroll. It's a little confusing. The Greek word biblios, bibliography, Bible, that's the word for scroll. So Bible really literally means scroll. So I'll say book scroll or codex. This is a codex. The plural of codex is codices. And sometimes I'll use that word. I'm not trying to stop me and remind me if you ask me if I throw those out there. But so this is a codex form. Most everybody uses a codex these days. We don't know who invented it, but the Christians almost certainly made it the thing to do. And we know that because most Greek and Roman literature, all the way up in the first few centuries, are still in the book scroll form. But Christians almost exclusively used the codex for text they consider very special. Some might say sacred, that's somewhat debated, but very, very special. It usually made the level of Scripture. Probably because they put Old and New Testament together. Well, that matters because the earliest manuscripts we have are copies of copies of the copies. We don't have the originals. And so when I look at the Greek New Testament, what we have are portions of different manuscripts put together like a patchwork quilt. And these manuscripts come in little fragments like this. This is P52. It's the oldest fragment we have that exists. Now, recently there's 3 or 4 documents that might actually be a little older, and this is pretty exciting, and that's because they keep discovering manuscripts if you didn't know that, kind of like Indiana Jones. They keep finding them in monasteries and caves and different stuff. Churches, libraries, down in old bins and whatever. And inside of mummy masks, the Egyptians typically wrap their dead like a mummy. Well, the average poor person didn't get all mummified like King Tut. They get wrapped in linen. They had a little mask. And since they were poor, they would get a piece of papyrus to wrap like the inside of a little mask to put on top, or linen. And what we found is, well, we humans, not me, but what archaeologists discovered is, for a long time, they've been just finding these bodies and they'll just throw away the mask. Well, inside of the mask, on the papyrus, were copies of the Gospels and other portions. And maybe a first century copy of a big chunk of the Gospel of Mark was discovered on the inside of a mummy mask. So which means either a Christian used it out of sacredness, like, hey, that's the text, I'm going to use it as I'm buried, the text, or some pagan just found it. And then we don't know where it came from. But that hasn't been released just yet. The people who are a part of it have said it's coming, but it has to go through all the channels and gets released in scholarship, and then it's judged by everybody who's a specialist. But so far, the real specialists have said this is the legit thing, and we'll see. But so far, right now, that the month public, P52 is the oldest, written around 110, 115, give or take 10, 15 years. It's from the Gospel of John. It's about the size of a credit card, and so it's not that big. When you put a credit card, it's on the front and back, which lets us know it's what? Is it a book scroll or it's part of a codex, it's part of a page. So that means at least by the end of the first century, the Gospel of John, or at least this portion, was on a codex page. Now, most historians would say, the odds are this isn't just one random page of just, hey, let's make up a story. The odds are very high. This is part of a page of the Gospel of John. And if you study it, and you can, people do, they study the exact length of distance in millimeters between letters. The spacings between the top and bottom are formal, so whoever did that is fairly good at writing. There's spaces in between the word. There's a little bit breathing marks. Those came later, which means we can tell a lot, and you can calculate the distance and how many lines were on a sentence compared to later, fuller text, and we can calculate exactly how many words per page, how many pages would have been in this codex just for John. And this was found in Egypt. So it means a copy of the Gospel of John made it to Egypt by the end of the first century. So this very well could be a copy of the original, or this could be a copy of the copy of the copy. We don't know how far removed it is from the original. It can't be that far removed because most scholars think John was written no later than 90. So if it's that late of a date, this could have been in the side of the original. In fact, I think it probably was, but that's a different story. So these are
the original codex?
I meant to say that, thank you. The original was almost certainly not in a codex form. Almost certainly, because when the documents are spoken of in the early century, they call them biblios, scrolls. Well, correct, book scrolls. Mm-hmm.
So are they papyrus?
Yes, ma'am, this is papyrus. The book is, yes, ma'am, that's exactly right.
Papyrus.
So all the pages are papyrus pages.
Okay.
That's
So
exactly
what's
right.
the scroll? Is it made
That's
out of-
also papyrus,
Okay.
but it's rolled up. That's
Okay.
exactly right. No, good
Okay.
question. Good question.
Would it be delicate?
They could, well, they're pretty firm. It depends on how old they are, how well they're treated. They can get brittle, but for a while they can last. If they're well treated and they're not, rained on or whatnot, or left in the mud kind of stuff, or heavily used of the oil and grease, then they can be used for a long time. And
David, do they know what verse or deal in John that
yes,
is?
ma'am, this is from the Gospel of John 18 something, and on the back is the same thing. I can't remember now in front of me. Oh, do I have it in my notes? No, I used to have it memorized.
This
John 13.
But
That's
that was
P45.
different.
Correct. That's a different page.
That's different.
So we don't have the originals. The originals are probably in a scroll, which is why this probably is not the original. Probably. We can't be sure, but probably not. It's probably from a codex that had pages like that. They would have been full pages, and these pages would have been gathered together and then sewn at the bottom and then collected in an early codex, what we call now a collection of books. But what's important are these manuscripts, they're ancient. So the manuscripts we do have, they're not that far removed from what we call the originals. Now this is the most updated list. I'm going to read the important ones for you. If you compare the New Testament manuscripts versus other ancient manuscripts of any other in the Western Hemisphere of the world, ours is overwhelming. So for example, in Homer, so here's Homer up here. He wrote the Iliad around 800 BC. The earliest manuscripts we possess were written around 400 BC. So that's about a 400-year time gap. Do you see that? He wrote it around 800 BC. The earliest tactile things we possess are 400 years after it. They've got about six. The old number means that's what people used to think, but this is a very updated list. Now there are about 1,750 manuscripts of Homer. Now a manuscript just means handwritten, manuscripta in Latin, handwritten. That's anything from whenever it was written all the way up to the printing press in 1500s. So anything that's if it's ever written by hand, it's a manuscript. No matter how small it is, it's a manuscript. It's the size of your thumb, that counts. If it's deemed to be independent. So a fragment, that includes the Bible, anything, okay, anything at all. Herodotus, there's a 1,350-year time gap between when it was written versus the earliest manuscripts we have. Sophocles, 102 years. Plato, 1,300 years. You see how far away that is? Demosthenes. In most of the manuscripts that we have in possession, Homer's got tons. That's the 1,700. Everything else, 109, 193, 210, 150, 200. So we barely have any manuscripts. Get down to the New Testament. You can't see it. They were written within 50 to 100 years after the originals. And we have about 5,700 copies. So we have way more manuscripts than any other literature in the Western Hemisphere of the world. And we have manuscripts that are the closest to the original more than any other ancient source in the whole world. Does that make sense what I'm going at there? Now that's a lot of times Christian apologists go, we kill them, we beat them. Well, there's more to it than that, but just before I move on for a second, my only point here is, it does get stinking close. It's not like 1,000 years later, that's the best we got. We can get real close. Now, whole copies of manuscripts come late. Well, I'll get there in a second. Let me just give you an example. My point of this right now, it is early and ancient. 2, if you dismiss the New Testament manuscripts as untrustworthy, then you, of course, will have to do what? You got to dismiss them all. If you're being fair, you got to dismiss all of these things. And I love how Bruce Metzger says it. No classical scholar would listen to an argument that the authenticity of Herodotus or Thucydides, those we just were on that screen, is in doubt because the earliest manuscripts of their works, which are of any use to us, are over 1,300 years later than the originals. Nobody does that. Any Roman historian go, we can't trust it whatsoever. We don't have any clue. They just trust that it was copied correctly because that's all you can do. But there's more to it. In the New Testament, look at the distribution. This is where our manuscripts come from. So most of our manuscripts come from the 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th, this big gap, the hill. And why is that? Because that's the monastic period is at its height in the medieval times. And so most of those manuscripts come from there. It's these, I put a red circle, these earlier ones are one that's really important to us, the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries. Of those, you see it's not nearly as many, but it's still a lot. So we've got all the way down to the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th. Those are the ones that we get real excited about. So P45 comes in that period and some others. And I'm going to give you another, more pictures here in just a second. So we have very ancient manuscripts close to the originals, but they're not the originals. They're just not. We don't have them.
Where are the originals stored, do you know?
Where are they stored now? We don't possess them. No one on earth has them.
The originals.
Yes, ma'am, that's right, the originals. And in textual criticism, it's actually kind of a hot topic to use the word original. For example, 2 Corinthians, or 2 Corinthians, whatever you want to call it, almost certainly is 2 different letters put together. Virtually every New Testament scholar thinks it's at least 2, if not 3. Chapters 10 through 12 probably is another letter, and if you want some time, you can look it up and see. It just seems like a closure and a beginning. And so 2 Corinthians is almost certainly, I think it is 2 different letters. Well, then the question is, what was original? If they're two different letters, when did this get put together as one letter? Because Paul didn't write two letters and then glue them together and then say, just send them both. He would have sent one, then a copy, then he sent another one, and eventually at some point they got put together. In fact, the leading theory now amongst most New Testament Pauline specialists and manuscript specialists say that all Paul's letter got combined together and got grouped together by the end of the first century, and that collection got copied together. So at some point early on, one in this 2 Corinthians, this joining got happened. So when we say the word original, what do we mean there? Because there's no way we... So it gets complex when we use the word original. But having said that, if we say it this way, if original means the thing Paul had someone write, because he had a scribe, and he would maybe write the ending, and he would say, all right, yep, I approve of that, send it on to Corinth. We don't have any of those. None of them. And probably because they were used so much, they eventually got rid of them. And they wrote a new copy, of course, and then got rid of it. Almost certainly. The Jews did not burn their texts, they buried them. They only buried sacred texts. If a manuscript of the Old Testament got worn out, they buried it. We have some evidence that Christians did the same thing. It's just we don't have that much evidence for it. But there is some evidence for that. So it's likely that's what happened. We have no originals of anything.
Is there any originals of the other works?
No, ma'am. No originals of any of them. That's correct. No Herodotus.
Any authors?
That's correct. Yes, ma'am. We've lost all of it.
What's the earliest Old Testament? I mean, what's the earliest Talmud that they've got?
Old Testament. That's a good question, and I'm glad you said that. Since I'm talking about Christianity, I'm obviously focusing on the New Testament manuscripts. Old Testament's a very good question, and maybe sometime we can reflect on that. In the Old Testament, this is a cool story. One second. I talk myself out of getting these markers. I won't need it. And then I always end up, I want to draw something. For basically ever, our oldest so here's the Hebrew text. This is a version of it. Torah Nephiim Ketuvim. It's right to left. So I'll pass this around. And here's a Hebrew English interlinear. If you've never seen one of these before, I'll pass them around. Forever, basically, the Hebrew, which most of the Old Testament is written in Hebrew, 99 point whatever percent of it is, some's in Aramaic. It comes from a group of manuscripts. I don't want to get bogged down, but that's for me. They're a group of manuscripts that come from around the year 800 AD. Around that year. So let's say it's 800. I'll put a little timeline. So this is 800. And of course, the Hebrew Bible and the portion of the Bible were written way before then, right? So let's call this year 01. So the Hebrews live way over here. So that's easily 1,000 to 2,000 years removed. Most Old Testament scholars think the Old Testament was composed and written down in its final form after they returned from Babylonian exile. So that's mid-6th century BC. So, we're talking about at least 1,000 to 1,500 years easily that we're removed from it. Okay, that's the Hebrew. That's the Hebrew manuscripts. Well, the Old Testament was translated into Greek at the end of the 1st century. And it's called the Septuagint. The shorthand Septuagint means the 70 writers, so they use the Roman numeral LXX for short, Septuagint. That's the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. We have copies of that from around, I think it's around the mid-3rd century. So let's say 300 to be safe. So that gets us back 500 years or so. Most Bibles forever, King James Version and all that, still use the Hebrew and sometimes use the Septuagint. It might help it out sometimes. But they found that Septuagint just oftentimes paraphrases things, and the verse is a little different here and there. Little footnote, for my sermon this Sunday, I probably won't mention this because there's, as you might imagine, an enormous amount of nerd details we could fill in a sermon that would bore people. But there's a verse that the Apostle Paul probably alludes to, but he doesn't allude to it from the Hebrew Bible. It's called the Masoretic text. He alludes to it from the Septuagint. And I can prove it because of the Greek used. And that's not a big deal for, you might say, who gives a rep? But there's those kind of signs show up all the time in the New Testament that Paul's Bible was not in Hebrew, it was in Greek because of the exact verbiage he uses. So Paul used this Bible not this Bible. We use this Bible. So very often in your Bibles has a little footnote, say Paul says, like it says in Isaiah, or like the scripture said, the word of the Lord said, da-da-da-da, footnote, Malachi 3. And you look at Malachi 3 and go, what in the world? That doesn't match. He was way off. He might have been, or he's not quoting from the Hebrew, he's quoting from the Septuagint version.
So how crazy, I mean, I just assumed that you were going to say that there was an earlier version of the Talmud or the Old Testament that was earlier than the
New Testament. Well, there is now. That was right. That's I'm building you up now. My big payoff of the story. So this is what we had forever until the late 40s, when something was discovered near the Dead Sea. Of course, we call them the Dead Sea Scrolls, and we always use DSS for shorthand and scholarship. The Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, which was a mass of cache in caves. This little shepherd boy was throwing pebbles, and he heard a psh. He went looking inside and found just a cache full of jar clays, full of things. And most of the documents were from the community itself, writing documents about itself, its theology, its behavior and ethics. It also included Old Testament text, and which was awesome because guess when these were written? No later than when the Romans came in. So this is the 1st century BC. 1st BC. Well then, imagine how excited Old Testament scholars were to read Hebrew Dead Sea Scrolls from the 1st century BC and compare them to the 800. So it's roughly 1,000 years. And for example, they had almost the entire book of Isaiah, which is gargantuan. I mean, it's a huge scroll. It was almost word for word. So almost 1,000 years had gone by, and the copying was almost identical. The Masoretes were known to count the letters, which is why they were called that. But anyway, they counted the line and then checked the Hebrew. They were close. It was systematic study. The Greek New Testament manuscripts are not so careful in the first few centuries. They get that careful. When they get to monasteries, then they're real careful. And then the variants or errors or changes minimize because they get real rigid. The first few centuries, not nearly as rigid as they get later on. The Hebrews are different. So today, the Bible you're using, you're passing around now, that Hebrew Bible mostly comes from, if you believe it or not, from this. And it's because it was so well done. And of course, the Dead Sea Scrolls aren't complete. These Masoretic scrolls are complete, and so we have every word. But they have used the Dead Sea Scrolls here and there to say, this probably is the better reading. But it didn't happen much. It didn't happen much at all. So that's a good question. Now, there's books just on Old Testament manuscripts that you certainly can read. That's a great question. So here's the Greek, and I want to pass around the Greek if you want as we go along. So that's the Greek Bible, the Hebrew Bible, and here's the Greek New Testament. Sorry, this is my original one from undergraduate days. It's kind of wet.
The one you lost.
No, actually, this is the one someone gave me. I gave away my original. No, this is it. I gave away the better copy. I'm so nice. The one I lost is different. I have that one still yet. And here's a Greek English interlinear. But good memory. That's good memory. So I'm going to pass both these around. You can see what you like. So we don't have the originals. We have copies of them. They go ancient. The second thing is this, and you stop me if this gets a little too confusing. Manuscripts come from different regions of the empire, and they have in different families. For example, the Alexandrian family, which is probably the most well-preserved of all the branches, the Western, the Byzantine. Now, if I went to the Giving Tree Preschool, and I get all the kids out, and they say, there's a bunch of siblings in here, and I go, I bet there are. Okay, I bet you and you go together. I bet you need to go together. You need to go together. You don't have a sibling, do you? I bet not. No. Okay, let's imagine I got it right, because some things were clear, like two redheads look very similar or something like that, blondes, and sometimes it's harder to tell. But then I look from the outside. But then I read them. I get to know them better. I go, yeah, you're telling the same story about the same dog, about the same. You have the same speech pattern, the same accent. I bet you go together, you go together, you go together. Now, because I paired them up, I want to put them in families. Now, the logical corollary is that they didn't come out of nowhere. They weren't popped into existence like a magic unicorn. They probably have parents. And I can deduce things about their parents based on them, their speech pattern, how tall they are, what color, what race they are, things like that, just because of the way they look. We do that all the time. That's what specialists do with manuscripts. So when they find a manuscript, they start comparing and contrasting. You look like this and you look like this. And then when I read you, you have the exact same spelling on this particular verse as this whole group. So when they find a new manuscript, it isn't just a wild, fancy 5,000, they're all scattered. No, they all really come down to about 3, 4, or 5 major families. They all related. What that means is, in different parts of the empire, way back when, there must have been a parent. So if you get someone from the Alexandrian family, someone from the Western family, and they're very similar, but they're from radically different parts of the empire, like Alexandria, Egypt, which is Alexandrian, or the Western might be from Rome, very different parts of the empire, but they're very similar, well then we are safe to deduce that those 2 manuscripts come from a parent that's even earlier. And they got split off to the 2 different regions. Are you staying with me here a little bit maybe? It's just like with my children, my children analogy, I can deduce they had parents, and I would deduce they have certain traits about them. So if I have a kid is born, I was born in 2012. I bet then, and most parents are this age, I bet your parents were born around 1980s, I bet, because that's probably how it usually works and da-da-da-da. That's what we do with actual manuscripts. If by the 1st century we've got manuscripts in Alexandria P52, that's in Egypt, and we got another from the Western around the same time, it means they probably come a manuscript that's even before the 1st century, and it got copied and spread to the regions. So that's a big deal. The reason why it makes it very probable they're trustworthy is that we have different manuscripts from these different regions that take us back all the way back to, certainly there must have been an early text that gave rise to these families at the end of the 1st century. Well, who gives a rip? Well, scholars sure do, historians do, because the Gospels, the whole New Testament, everything in the New Testament was all written and finished by the end of the 1st century. And Mark was almost certainly written first. I think it was written, might be early 60s. Some scholars say the average answer is around 70. Let's say 70. So if Mark is written in AD 70, but we're not sure, and we have copies of Mark, manuscripts that come to the end of the 1st century, that's 30, 40 years removed from that. Now, the earliest full copies of Mark we have come from around 225. That's about 170 years after the original was written. I'm trying to get, so that's close. So the families matter. The families matter a whole lot. And lets us know this is not thousands of years later. It's not even 500. It's not even 200 years later. We know that the manuscripts we have were based on texts that go back to the 2nd century. Now that's really, really cool. Now, another thing this matters, because every time you read Bart Ehrman, if you hear him, he's going to show up on CNN or the TV shows, and he's got brand new books saying you can't trust it and so forth. And a lot of what he says is right. It's the melodrama that sells the books that's wrong. Because it's so early, now stay with me, because it's early, and because it comes in different parts of the empire, it means there's no way any ecclesial authority could have blocked out books not getting into the Bible. There's no way some power, massive pope, there's no pope yet. There's no pope. Pope doesn't come to the 3rd and 4th century. Most say Pope Leo around 480. But anyway, that's a little debated. But we're hundreds of years. Christianity is not even legal yet. It's still a religio illicita, an illegal religion. There is no power structure to put in stories and take out stories and change all up. And we want Jesus to have 12, so let's scratch it in there. That's impossible. It's impossible. There is no authority structure that can make these major families all change it up in a short period of time around the empire. So that's impossible. So there is no orchestrated attempt to suppress or change the manuscripts. That's good news for us. That's not different. Like Islam, that's exactly the opposite of what happened. In Islam, when they had different copies of the manuscripts, one faction of Islam, of the Muslims, grabbed the ones they liked the most and literally burned the other manuscripts, and then make copies of the one tradition they had left over, and then say, see, we've always had one. It's you Christians that can't trust yours. That's really what, they all know that. That's what happened early on. So this is good stuff when you have stuff that goes back earlier. Can I pause there? Any questions? If not, I'll move on. That's the most technical of what we're going to do. I'm trying to help you. But number 3, it's not the telephone game. Well, David, I thought the copies of copies. You know how the telephone game works. You know in Britain they call it Chinese whispers? Bunch of racist. I'm just kidding. It's called Chinese whispers, but here we call it telephone game. So, I like blue elephants. And then it goes around and it says, I eat cake. I mean, it's haha, it's funny, haha. It's to be silly. That's not how manuscripts worked. That's not how it worked at all. First off, it's written, not oral. so they can see word for word exactly what was said. There's multiple lines of transmission. So it's much more like I read aloud the Bible and you all make a copy in my presence, or I give you a copy and then you look at the same copy, then you look at the same copy, you look at the same copy. That's more. There's multiple lines. And then y'all all move off. You go to New York, you go to Vegas, you go to Florida. There's multiple lines of transmission, and then they get copied over here, and y'all live in Florida, New York. And then also, they almost certainly still had access to the original copies. This is really, to me, it's very, very neat. A guy named Tertullian was an early church father. He lived in the 2nd century, so the mid, let's say, 150s to be fun. Tertullian was an early church father, and he says in his, well, it's translated, The Prescription Against Heretics, in chapter 36, he says that you can go to the churches and still find the authentic or original documents. And he's saying you can still go to the major churches where these, like in Philippians, Corinth, and find the original manuscripts. That's the middle of the 2nd century. Now, maybe he's mistaken, maybe he's lying, or maybe he's telling the truth, he knows what he's talking about. Well, if you take that information, and another leading scholar, his name is George Houston, he states that literary documents on papyrus, if they're, depending on their usage, can last up to about 200 years. That's across the empire. So you put these facts together, it is not unlikely at all, I would dare say it's historically plausible, that the original documents that we no longer possess, they did possess them, they kept them, they were very sacred to them, and they got a home, they got planted to the original audience to which they eventually landed. Either they were written there originally, or eventually they got planted there, whatever, and that people would go and make copies from the original, and then go to where they're in the empire. Even go there, go make the copies and go. As Tertullian says, go visit for yourself. But the assumption is people would go visit or could go visit to see the original manuscript. And eventually, when the copy got so worn out, they didn't need it anymore. They would get rid of it because they had what they would consider to be good copies. And there's also evidence that happened early on because the manuscripts themselves, those pieces of paper, when they start introducing, for the podcast, papyrus is not paper. I'm pointing to a piece of paper with a copy of papyrus. So papyrus is not paper. That's where we get the word, though. They had breathing marks. Well, that means it's used in liturgy. It's used in church services. And the breathing marks got there early on. They're not consistent, but they got there early on, which shows that very early on these texts were sacred. They were used for public worship. And that almost certainly when they were copied, they were held in such high esteem that they took it very carefully. And they were very careful with it. And a brand new book just came out, just got 2016, and it's a very complicated but a technical book arguing that the manuscripts were in fact copied very, very carefully, which is probably somewhat in response to Bart Ehrman, but that's a different story. So it's not the telephone game. Another thing is this is real fun too. When you find, you have big pieces of manuscript, like here's a copy of P45 you have there, they have bigger copies of books. Well, a couple of decades ago, several decades now, they went to Oxyrhynchus, which is in Egypt, and they were looking through the trash dump. And in the trash dump, they found thousands of documents of papyrus. And now, most of the manuscripts we have in the ancient world from Rome and Greece are about taxes or taking inventory. That's really common. 14 bays of hay, what are they called? Bales of hay. 15 loads of fish. Inventory is very common. Or things they were purchasing, bills of sale. That's really popular. Letters between spouses or friends. And they found biblical manuscripts. So in a trash dump. Well, they found fragments. Well, here's the good news. On the left side here is Codex Vaticanus, written about mid-4th century. So this is, say, mid-300s. It's exquisite. Look how well done that is. Even got a little color. So this is, you may not know this is exquisite, but it sure is. See the edging here? Can y'all see that far? See the holes where this was sewn together in a codex form? Both pages. They have, this is from the book of, I think it's from the book of Hebrews. Because I think it's Pros Hebraios means, I think, to the Hebrews. Anyway, they've got the letters are straight. You can measure the good copyists by how straight the lines were, how consistent their letters were, the spacing between the letters. They've got a couple breathing marks there, the spacing of the columns. All this stuff was measured out. And the stoikoi, or the spacing of the letters themselves, you were charged by that. So when a person wrote it, you were charged by how many stoikoi or letters you had per line. And this thing is so well done. The earlier manuscripts aren't so pretty. You can tell they're not as trained, perhaps, when they did it. Most of what you have now in your Bible for the New Testament comes from Codex Vaticanus, or another manuscript that's like this one called Codex Sinaiticus. It's a different family. That's great. 2 big, full, fat copies of the Gospels. Some are in different order. Some don't have. We're missing some parts, like that copy on the paper there. See how much you're missing there? Well, when they found the trash dump of Oxyrhynchus Papyrus on the right side, that's just one example. That's Papyrus number 1228. It's from the late 3rd century. So it's roughly 50 to 100 years earlier than this one on the left. Well, it's always exciting when you find something, because the issue is you want to compare it, right? Because you're going back in time like a time traveler. Well, you see how fragmentary it is, but nevertheless, when you compare it, this is not from Hebrews, I don't think, but the analogy still works. You compare it side to side, and guess what they find is, on these Oxyrhynchus Papyrus, the manuscripts are really good. They have some errors, changes, but they're almost all spelling, verb tenses, and whatever. Those you immediately can recognize that's what they meant to say. They didn't have spell check. It's not Microsoft or Google or something. So when we find, so the point, of course, is when we go, that's my point here. The earliest fragments we keep finding, like Indiana Jones, they corroborate what we already knew. That's good news. It'd be much more disturbing if those early fragments say Jesus had 13 disciples, he really was a woman, he's from Vegas, he's Canadian, they were Native Americans. That would be, oh my goodness. Either we would say a brand new sect, but what if it sounded real similar but had some key differences? He really didn't die on the cross. That's what Muslims say. And we went, oh my goodness. That's not what ever happens. All through the last several decades, every time we find more manuscripts, it keeps corroborating. It confirms, it does not disconfirm. And that's a really, really good deal. Number 5, there are no major lacunae. A lacuna is plural, is a gap, is what we use the word for lacunae. Maybe the end of Mark, but for example, here's a copy of part of the Dead Sea Scroll. Remember I told you about how Isaiah, we went back all in your board up here, back to 1st century BC. So, in fact, I think this might be the Isaiah scroll, but look at the bottom here. You see the big gaps? It looks like someone just ripped it or burned it up. Well, what happens if you don't know what's in the scroll there? If you don't have another manuscript of the exact same book, it looks like this. We just don't have a daggum clue. We don't have a clue what it says. So when you transliterate the Hebrew, look at this gap here. That gap is a hole. Well, in English, to do the hole, they put in parentheses, bracket, ... for the son, so, bracket, NS. NS is where it starts. ... bracket. Look down here with the ... dots. That means we have no idea. And when scholars try to fill in the gaps, like up here, for the and then here up here, the spirit of, in the bracket, that means just a human like us, some scholar, what's called a scholarly emendation. It's a guess, but it's an educated guess. If it said Jesus went down to the sea of, and he had fish, the odds are it's Galilee. But we would write in brackets if there's a hole. So when you look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, some of these documents, we can't compare it. We have no other manuscripts ever. It's lost in history forever and ever and ever. And that's why it's going to look like this when they transliterate it. But guess what happens in the New Testament? Nothing like that exists. We have nothing like this in the New Testament. You're saying, David, yes we do. You gave me a copy of this manuscript right here. And it's incomplete. And you're right. But that's why I keep saying, if you can't compare it to other manuscripts, we can take this exact manuscript here and compare it to other ancient manuscripts, and it fills in the gap perfectly. Does that make sense? It doesn't say, and then he ate a dog. It's like, what? That doesn't fit at all. It just, nope. That's exactly what you'd expect.
That was one of a kind.
Correct. That exists. That's right. We use the word extant. Extant. That means it's still around. We can touch it like this piece of paper or the napkin. It's extant. And that's good news. When we get fragments like P52, remember that little thing of the credit card, that first image, that little baby one this big? When you take that and compare it to John, guess what? It fits like a puzzle piece. Does that make any sense? And that's how exciting that is when we find it. It'd be bad news if it didn't fit like a puzzle piece. Now that's a little melodramatic. There are some changes, but it's very close. When there are changes in the text, because they're not copied perfectly, there's no spell check. They did not copy them perfectly. They didn't. When they're not copied perfectly, we call that a variant. You might call it a mistake. Well, that depends, because sometimes they did it on purpose. We call it a variant. And if you want to go to sleep faster than listen to me, you go home and try to copy by hand the Gospel of Mark and see how well you do. Bring it next week and let's compare it. How well did you do? Oh, let's use here. And you're going to does that mean you don't love Jesus? Does that mean you're a dirty, rotten sinner? Or does it mean you didn't copy well? I mean, you just sometimes, and there are very common mistakes. When people look page to page and they go side to side and they go back to this one, they go down a line and then go back to the original and then go back to the original, or they copy it on accident. They have words for didography. They have all these special technical words for the common mistake. And then they misspell them. How many ways can you spell the word there? Right? There's 3. Well, if you're in mind, you say, and then those women had their food was lifted from them, or their whatever. Well, in your mind, you might fill in the gap, but spell something very differently. Happens all the time. We send an email, you proofread it over and over and over, and you still send it. Dadgummit, I know I read that right. Well, that's what they did. Which means when we look at the old manuscripts, scholars read those and go, hey, is it a free-for-all? Are they all wrong? Well, there's a lot of mistakes. And Bart Ehrman and others will say there are more variants than there are words in the New Testament. And that's right. There are more variants. The question is not the amount, but the quality. If I could take exactly what you copied from Mark last night, Gene and Van, I get them together and I go, I get your copies, here's your Dunkin' Donuts copy. And I look at it and I go, there, that's the spelling. I'm going to circle that one. I mean, how easy would it be if you did it in English, which I read the best, and I go, she meant this. And now I'll say, okay, here's my marked up. Now, redo it. Or don't redo it, and I pass around and say, with these mistakes, do you think we still know exactly what you meant? Just because you misspelled it or put the word wrong? Of course you would. Well, if I clean that up, and then I put in a fancy thing called a binding, and I sold it to you, and I call it a Bible. And that's what you have in your Bible. That's what those manuscripts that I passed around, the Old New Testament, those books, not the manuscripts, but the books, those are cleaned up. That's when scholars look at it and go, oh, they misspelled that. Here's what they meant to say. Or some manuscripts say this. There's about 99% of those variants, in fact, it's about 99.5, are completely inconsequential. About 70% of them are simply, they're variants that cannot be translated. For example, we say something called like the movable nu. It's the ending of it looks like the N. It looks like a V, but it has the N sound. Well, that's not even translatable if it's moved, but that's called a variant if it's not there. If it's different from another manuscript, it's called a variant. What about when I say, a apple or an apple? That's a variant. So the vast majority of variants that exist, anybody who knew Greek go, that's what they meant to say. It's done. Then about 0.5% of all the variants, and there are a lot of them because there are a lot of manuscripts, are what we call meaningful and viable. Those don't affect doctrine whatsoever. And how to read the Bible for all it's worth, we looked at some of those. For example, in Mark 16:9 and following, that's that so-called long ending of Mark. It originally ended in 8 of the manuscripts we have. Now, it's possible that Mark originally kept on going, but we don't have it. That's what a lot of scholars would say. I think he ended in 8 on purpose, and whoever was copying it wanted to say, hey, I don't like this ending. And the women went away. They didn't tell anybody because they were afraid. Well, I don't like that because Matthew ends better, and so does Luke. So I want to make up a resurrection appearance. And that's what the scribes like to do. They like to conflate the stories. That's one why we can always tell what they've done is because they love to harmonize because they knew the gospel so well. They would fill in the gaps with their verbs or word orders from a different gospel. John 7:53 to 8:11, the woman caught in adultery. That story does not exist in the earliest manuscripts. That doesn't exist until about the 4th and 5th century manuscripts. So this story existed and floated out there in church land and landed, not in our earliest manuscripts, but later. In some manuscripts, that story is in Luke. Some manuscripts is in John, in different orders of John. And then it landed where it landed. And if you excise that out of John, if you practice it one day on your own, it reads so smoothly when you take the story out. It's just it seems like an odd place for it to have landed. But that's why a lot of commentators won't even comment it. And I'll never preach on it for that reason. I don't think it's original to John. You're not going to hell if you do, if you read it. I'm just saying. I might one day preach from it just for fun. Then so these things your Bibles are going to tell you in a footnote. These are not in the earliest manuscripts. Then your Bibles may not show the other ones depending on the Bible you use, Mark 1:1, things like that.
Well, every once in a while, doesn't it seem like we hear that they found the scrolls, these scrolls? I'm sure they're not the original, but it seems like every once in a while in the news somewhere you'll hear that they found some of the Dead Sea Scrolls somewhere.
Great question. I don't know of any announcements recently that say they keep finding Dead Sea Scrolls, because those have all been excised and not eradicated, but extirpated from the caves. They've gotten out. You do hear once in a while of a new find, the copper scroll or the copper this, an ancient find. Typically, and I don't mean mean about this, typically if y'all hear about it, if it made it to the news, usually, if not all the time, it's just for sensation. Scholars don't think that's actually a compelling thing. And so it's got to be some document like, this document, ancient document says Jesus was married. And all of a sudden it goes, it makes the news everywhere. And then they'll go find one or two people go, this is probably written in the first century, it's probably earliest. And they won't quote all the other New Testament scholars who go, no, it wasn't. And we can tell you why it wasn't. But they found a couple who say it because that makes the news and makes the money and makes whatever. So you'll hear about it every once in a while. Like I told you tonight, some might be on the face of that mask of the mummy. But as those come out, they will take a while. And then those might make it to the news, would probably be like page 8 kind of thing. It might be there. But they want to find sensational stuff that.
Greek or Hebrew.
Which is the hardest to learn, Greek or Hebrew? That's a great question, of course, and that so much depends on the person. I found Greek a lot easier than Hebrew. Greek grammar is a lot more simple. It is simpler than Greek. Hebrew is. It really is. They only have, it doesn't, let me give details, it's easier. But because the letters are Semitic, you got to learn the letters and learn the words and learn the grammar. Greek, sometimes you'll see it looks, I kind of recognize that once I start learning how to read it better, because English has comes so much sometimes from Greek, from Latin or Greek or German. But so that I found it easier. But it is more complex grammar, Greek is. Yeah. I knew people who loved Hebrew, and I liked it, but I loved Greek. We just had different. But you can learn it. My professor used to say, Wayne Stacy, the dean of the divinity school, used to say in my Greek class, he goes, right now, little children all over Greece can speak Greek just fine. And if they can, you can too. Because all these old people are like, oh, it's so hard, or whatever it was. And he said, right now, little kids all over. So the bottom line is, do we know for certain exactly what the original said? We don't. We do not know for 100% certain what the original Gospel of Mark said, because we do not have the original Gospel of Mark. What we have are almost certainly very reputable early manuscript copies of the original. And when we keep finding fragments and it corroborates it, it makes it more historically probable the more we keep discovering ancient fragments. So do we know 100% certain? Nope. Is it very likely? Yes. Most New Testament specialists and historians, even if they're Christian or not Christian, would say that we have in this, here's the Greek, this is the Nestle, this particular version, this is the Nestle Aland version of the Greek New Testament, that here in the top part, or in the critical apparatus at the bottom, where all the little other ancient manuscripts say, somewhere between the top or the bottom, between these top and bottom possibilities, or what they think it was original, is the original. That if I could go back to the original Mark, I'm looking, let's see, here's Luke, I'll just stay on Luke. Luke 24:36, the appearance to the disciples. And this says, they're walking along, blah, 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 that if I read that and looked at all the manuscripts at the bottom, if I compare that, if Luke just showed up, here's my original, pop and go, look at there. That most scholars say we're about 99.99% sure we're looking at what he originally said. With some things we're not sure. Some things in manuscript tradition, we have two different families, they're both very old and have different words. Like, don't know. Mark 1:41, the leper comes up and says, will you heal me? And he says, sure. Most manuscripts say, and he felt compassion on him, splagnoi. Other ancient manuscripts say, and he was angry, full of orgistai, he was rageful. Well, which one is it? They're both ancient. What a lot of New Testament scholars would say is, the harder the reading, it's probably the more original reading, because it's more likely to most historians that scholars softened it through the time, so that it didn't make Jesus look too bad or mean or embarrassed or whatever. And so that's why a lot of people would say, was mad is probably original. But it get kind of scrubbed out of history real quickly when scribes said, we felt compassion. And because not only is it the easier reading, compassion, it also comports to other stories in the gospel where it's clear that he had compassion. So they probably filled in the gaps. Oh, he always felt compassion versus, does that make sense? So they have a science to it. It's not a willy-nilly blind guy. It's a, that goes with Shakespeare, goes with Chinese. It doesn't matter. Textual criticism is not a religious exercise. So it's probable. Any questions or comments about that? I want to move on. But I wanted to cover this tonight. That's my main thing I want to cover was external data. So I can go back and unpack anything you want or move on. You tell me. I don't want to feel like I rush because we've got time. Nothing at all. I really hope you're not discouraged when on the news you hear people. There's a guy named Bart Ehrman who teaches at UNC Chapel Hill, and a smart guy, articulate. He's a good author. I think he's a clear speaker and clear author. I don't particularly like to hear him speak because of his vocal inflections, but he's a clear guy. He's a smart guy. He was a Christian. In fact, he was a very, very conservative Christian in his undergraduate. And Bart Ehrman is from the great city of Lawrence, Kansas. Went to Lawrence High, and he went off to school. I think it was Wheaton College, and conservative. Then went to Princeton for his master's. And while he was there, and you were at Bart Ehrman, right? Or someone I was talking to some other day. Someone at this church was there. Was 1 year ahead of him. I think it was Hyacinth. I think Hyacinth was there. I think it was Hyacinth.
What was his last name?
Ehrman, E-H-R-M-A-N. E-H-R-M-A-N. Ehrman. And he's on all over YouTube, bestseller books. I mean, tons of it. His primary specialty, he's a New Testament scholar and New Testament manuscripts, textual criticism. That's his main specialty. And when he went off to his master's degree, he did a paper on Mark. I feel like I'm blocking this every time. I know exactly and I forget it. It's in Mark's Gospel when Jesus is speaking. And he says, it's when the high priest, when Abiathar was the high priest in the time of David, Well, probably that priest wasn't the high priest during David, depending on how you read it and whatever. Well, Bart Ehrman wrote like a 50-page paper defending all the different options of how you can kind of get around what seems to be a problem in that text right there. And the professor, gave him a good grade and turned it in on the top of the paper. It said, why couldn't have Mark just got it wrong? And for Bart Ehrman, that was the first of the end of the world for him, because he said, it hit me like a ton of bricks that what if he was wrong? Well, if he was wrong, then why trust any of it? Because he's grown more fundamentalist where it's all or nothing, the baby, the bathwater kind of thing. It's got to be inerrant, without error, and the original, the copies and everything. Well, then he studied more manuscript traditions later on and realized not one single manuscript is identical to another one. Not one. There's some variation, some variant, some spelling error or whatever. And then, of course, for him, he talks about all this openly. He calls it a deconversion. Then I realized, well, if God inspired it, then why didn't he inspire the copying? If we don't have the originals, if he didn't inspire the copying to keep it the exact same, then why in the world would you assume the originals were inspired? Well, that started more problems. And then he had some issues with the evil and suffering in the world. And it was a long process. Eventually, he left the faith. Then got his PhD at Princeton under Bruce Metzger. I quoted him earlier. Bruce is generally considered the finest North American textual critic of the 20th century. I mean, he was a powerhouse. He died not too long ago. He was one of Bruce Metzger's last students, in fact, PhD students. And they co-wrote a couple things together, and he's a bright guy. Well, he did his PhD thesis, his dissertation, on what he would later rewrite into a book called The Orthodox Corruption of Scripture. So he made the argument, when you look at the manuscripts, when scribes changed certain things, they did it on purpose because they had an agenda to make it orthodox, their version of orthodoxy. Well, I read that book in my PhD, and I didn't find it compelling, but some of it probably is right, but a big chunk of it is not, and there's a lot of fatal problems to it, and it had some acceptance among scholars. A lot had the same problems I did. But then he wrote that on a popular level, this idea that it's all corrupt, we can't trust it, we don't know it. And that book was called Misquoting Jesus. He wanted to call it Lost in Transmission, but the publisher said they will think in Texas it's about vehicles transmission. For real. So the publisher said you can't call it Lost in Transmission, they'll be all confused. So it changed to Misquoting Jesus. That was a massive bestseller on New York Times. Everything he writes now is a bestseller. And in that book, it explains on an elementary level what I've been talking about tonight and on elementary level, textual criticism. And he goes on and on to talk about these variants, Mark 16:9, John 7, Mark 1. He's got a list of about a dozen that for him are big deals. Big deals. The problem is, in the real world of scholarship, he knows they're not that big of a deal. They change the meaning of that text. Yes, they do. If Mark 1:1 says, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, and then in brackets, the Son of God. Well, the Son of God doesn't show up in some ancient manuscripts. I did a paper on that in my PhD, just that clause. Well, if it's not there, it changes the meaning of that sentence. It doesn't change the meaning of the gospel whatsoever. And that was my final conclusion of the paper, which really ticked off the professor and all the students. We read that and thought, why even write? I said, it doesn't matter. This is not meaningful. It changed the sentence, but not the gospel. The gospel already makes the point that he's the Son of God. That's exactly why the Roman soldier says it on the cross. It just doesn't change the fact. Mark 16:9-11, the ending. There's nothing there at all. Now, it changes the meaning if you can get bitten by snakes or not have. That's that faith of snake handlers. That comes from there. Sure, it changes that. But at no time in the history of Christianity was getting bit by snakes or having a faith of that, serpents, ever a tenet of anybody's theology or practice. We have no other evidence in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th century that there was major church movements of snake handlers. There was just not a doctrine or behavior of the church. The woman caught in adultery doesn't affect one iota of doctrine. He's going to bring up one in Hebrews where it depends on which word. Did Jesus die apart from God or, what's the other word now? My podcast people are going to be yelling at me because they know it. Apart from God, it's the Greek word sounds similar to or blank with God. It changes the meaning of that sentence. But Bart says it changed the whole meaning of the entire Hebrews and all of theology. There's another verse, it's in 1 John, that nobody has used in any translation, I think since the King James Version, about the Trinity. But no one uses that anymore. But he'll go to that verse. Now that's been gone for 500 years, roughly, 450, or whatever. He still says it. So what it is in the popular level, he makes, as it were, mountains out of molehills. He'll give 12 to 15 examples and go, see, this kind of changes everything. And I'm not being mean. If you were sitting right here, I'd say, come on, Bart. I mean, he knows this. Because if I lined up 100 other textual critics and said, now, Bart, can you convince them that this is as important as you make it? And he'd say, I don't care, David. I hear that. Okay, you don't care, it's fine. But it matters to me that the vast majority of all New Testament specialists of this field do not think these are a big deal. Bruce Metzger, his mentor, said they're not a big deal at all. No one does, only Bart, and of course that sells a lot of books. And it makes you on CNN, it gets you to the Daily Show, and gets you on the Today Show, and did you know there are more variants? And it creates this huge discouragement and suspicion for a lot of Christians, because here's a New Testament scholar who says we can't trust it.
And he misleads a lot of people.
He misleads a lot of people. And for atheists, he's their only number one go-to scholar. Every atheist on any debate is going to tell you, listen to a YouTube video. They will say, and Bart Ehrman, one of the leading New Testament, he's the leading New Testament scholar in the world. No, he's not. No, he's not. He's a smart guy, but he's not the leading. No, he's not. If you had listed the top 100, I don't know if he might make that, maybe. And out of American scholars, not around the world, he wouldn't. So all I have to say, I'm not there. I don't teach at all university. I'm not dogging them. I'm just saying, when you're an atheist, and that's the one you go to because it makes your point, it really can lead people astray, and including Christians. That's all.
Got marketed a lot.
Marketed a whole lot.
Yeah, misquoting.
That one did, and he's got all kinds of them. He's just got a lot, and boy, they sell out fast. Good for him. And a lot of proceeds go to the charities. He has a very popular blog. You have to pay to get on, but all the money goes to a charity. And married to a devout Christian. He said he still likes Christmas time and going to the church. He said, I still get moved emotionally. Just not true. But he and his wife have a lot of conversations.
Where did you say he went to school?
He went to Wheaton College, and then he went to Princeton. But again, in all fairness, I think he's a good author. I agree with... I fantasized several times I've ever debated different people, like in a formal setting. And I've always thought, I have, because I listen to the stuff and read it all the time, and this is what we do is in our field. And I've always thought I would start out and say, after Bart presented, I'd say, I'm sorry, audience, this is going to be very boring. I agree with about 98% of what he just said. There's not much of a debate. He's going to talk about everything I just presented here to y'all. He's going to say the same stuff. He's going to say the same stuff. He's going to say, manuscript, this. But he's going to say, we don't know. He's going to scream it. We don't know what the originals are. We don't know. And I'm going to say, I agree. So that's not a debate. I agree. We don't know for certain, and that's what he means. But what he won't say in debate publicly, because he's been in a lot of them, he won't say, but it is very likely that what we have is behind closed door in scholarship and literature. Yes, he does. He will make detailed arguments of the authenticity of Paul's letters based on exact words. Well, the words come from manuscripts that he doesn't even trust or says you can't know. You see, in other words, it's a good show, but when you get, and a lot of scholars will say that, they'll say there's Bart in the world, and there's Bart in scholarship, and because you can't get away with that junk in scholarship. They will they won't do that. But I'm just trying to encourage you. I'm not trying to dog him. I agree with a lot of what he says. It's the conclusion he draws. It really comes down to, for him, number 6. He's going to say, no, these things are very important, and almost nobody else does, and I don't. I've looked at all of them, whatever that's worth to you. In my PhD, I had a whole class on this. I've read an enormous amount of literature. I've been as open-minded as I can be. They don't affect a single major significant doctrine of the church. Nothing. They do change the meaning of those sentences, maybe the paragraphs, maybe sometimes that document as a whole, but not the Christian faith. But if you've never heard this before, it can really rattle people. And I've met people, they'll email or call. I saw him, he said, Bob, I read that book, and it rattled them because they weren't exposed to it. So I kind of feel like it's my job in life the last several years to go expose all the Christians I can in a safe environment to say it's okay to ask questions, have doubts, whatever. And
what's the variance in the other non-Christian books?
That's a good question.
There has to be a variance, right?
Yes, ma'am, that's exactly right. You got it exactly right. So they all have variance.
1% variance in the Bible.
No, it's less than 1% that affect some meaning at all.
Okay, so what's the variance in other documents?
That affect the meaning?
Yeah.
And I don't know. And I'm sure that depends on the document itself. And part of the problem, that's a great question, but part of the problem again is we have what they call an embarrassment of riches. The reason why we have so many variants is because we have so many manuscripts.
Yeah.
Every time you copy, if one page and one page and you've got 27 differences, well, that's tallying quick. Well, if I've got a Herodotus or something or whatever, and I've got 15 manuscripts, well, I'm not going to have nearly as many as variants. So you might have none of these really affect the great meaning, or maybe there's 15. The problem is we just have so many. The numbers might sound overwhelming. So they might have less, but that's because they have fewer manuscripts and fewer chances to get it wrong or change it.
Trying to make the point that, stuff to back.
Yeah, that's right.
You know.
That's exactly right. There's a whole lot of stuff people consider true. That's exactly right. The biggest problem, and I can move on if you want, or we can keep talking as much as you want. The biggest problem most people have with this subject tonight is for those who have a particular understanding of inspiration, like Bart did, which is why he eventually had the faith. If you believe that God inspired the authors, and by that you mean he inspired them to write down exactly what he wanted, or he overtook them somehow, and there was plenty of inspiration, the question then you have to ask is, if he did that, then why didn't he inspire the copyists? And if he did not inspire the copyists, why not? If he did inspire them, why do they have all the variants? Why do that to us? Why didn't God inspire them to keep the original? Because it'd be so important to us. So those are the kind of questions he asked. But those questions, it seems to me, are only problematic if you hold to a particular view of inspiration where it's only authoritative if it's copied perfectly and or all the words are preserved, you might say preserved perfectly. There's a significant portion of North Americans that do. Most Christians around the world do not have that kind of view of what's called inerrancy or inspiration. Most don't. But in North Americans, there's a lot of the fundamentalists that do. And Bart Ehrman's books are like kindling on fire. I mean, they just, because they go to like he did before he deconverted. I mean, they'll go to fight this. If any of this stuff is true, it means none of it's to be trusted. So they're fighting off the same thing he fought off, but he, quote unquote, gave in and changed his mind. But you don't have to have that view of inspiration if you don't want, but some people do.
I think most Christians believe that you have to have that faith. You have to have faith that it's what the Lord wants us to have.
He seemed to be looking for an out.
Yeah. Because if we knew it for certain, we wouldn't have to have faith, that.
Maybe. I hear what you're saying. Yeah, maybe if we knew for certain, we wouldn't have to faith. Respectfully, I see that a little differently because, again, I think of, we can use faith as being uncertain, therefore we trust even when we're not certain. In a popular language, and I get that. Biblically speaking, that's not how it's used. Biblically speaking, almost always, faith means a rational trust. I have faith, you have faith that chair's working, which is why you're sitting in it. It's not a blind leap of whatever. It's a rational, no, it makes sense to trust my wife, my friends, my whatever. So in that sense, I do have faith that the manuscripts were reproduced faithfully because I have reason to think that they were reproduced. I don't like just close my eyes and go, I just believe God must have done it. People can do that. I don't, because we actually have evidence that it was it transposed through time well, that it was copied well, and that where there are variants, we can spot them. There's simple spelling errors and whatever. So for me, which is why I'm looking at historical issues, like I would compare to Mormonism, whatever, is do we have the evidence to back it up? Where your definition of faith in that usage in that sentence might be more needed or helpful is these other ancient texts like Herodotus, Thucydides, and whatever. When you got a 1,000-year time gap, you got to have some blind faith, right? Because we don't have the originals. That's a long stinking time for things to change. There, in my opinion, it's even more improbable, but we still have reason to trust it that it's true because of various reasons. Like some of these stories, why would they make it up? They seem to fit the historical world we know. That same kind of a corroboration issues. Well, if we can kind of trust that already, how much more should we trust our manuscripts based on the evidence? Based on the evidence. Some say, well, if God wanted us to have the originals, we would have worshipped it. We would have made idols out of that and all that. Some people say that. I don't find that compelling either, but maybe so. Maybe so. I don't.
Problem is then a book like misquoting Jesus just allows.
It confirms for them, yeah. That's right. For them, it's corroboration. See, it says here he's a leading New Testament scholar, and I had never heard this in my life. And why trust any of that stuff? Why trust? Yeah, that's right. And then there are numerous other books written that give what I've just said, but it's much more of an even-handed approach. Those will make top seller lists. No one's going to buy. That's not sensational. You said they're going to be even-handed. Read Larry Hurtado. It's in the handout, right? Larry Hurtado, the Gospels. If you go back, if you want to read some real good literature, read that. Read some other, there's other stuff I could recommend, but yeah, there's good stuff there. Yeah.
But I just love it.
Yeah. Well, but what I do is, I'll say two quick things. One is about Bart Ehrman, and another was about, when I have used this on a conversational level, if I have the time, I unpack it. If I don't, what I say is, those like these big three, quite probable, very probable. And I think I preached on this before, and I said I get down to about 60 seconds. And I have three things. One, I think God is the best explanation for a wide range of facts about the reality of the universe. Two, I think Christianity has the most historical information and corroboration and evidence of any world religion, the most historical evidence we have. Three, a religious experience that corroborates it. So that's my nutshell. If they ask me, what do you mean historical evidence for Christianity?
Then that's when
I go, I mean two things. I break it in two categories, external and internal. We have very good manuscript tradition. I can trust it got copied good well. We have good internal evidence because the stories it tells are corroborated. That's next week.
outside of the.
Correct. And they're very plausible. And I'm going to defend all that next week. So does that make sense? So in my mind,
That's better.
Well, that
helps me.
well, that's my. Hopefully, that's the outline is for. That's why it's. So that's my big three. If they put me on the first one, what about God? There are several things I think God's the best explanation. I can rattle them off. Doop, 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 doop. You might not do all 10. Just do whatever you think compels you. But I know mine. If they say, what about that Christianity stuff? I can do 2 parts. Which one do you want to talk about? And then or what about religious experience? I can talk about that too. Now, I didn't do that overnight. I didn't get there overnight. I didn't. It's taken me, 3 graduate degrees and a lot of reading to get there. But that's why I do what I do. I really mean that. I see this as an act of service. I don't get an extra tip by the chirpers. I want to help Christians be equipped to be better disciples. I want to expose you to this kind of stuff. That's why I started to say by the encouragement. I would hate for people to be discouraged when they hear about Bart Ehrman and the new study came out, found out none of it's trusted. I want to say, wait a second, I at least been exposed at one time. And we read that stuff, and I can go back to my notes, or I'll ask David, or I can, something like that. So I'm trying to expose it to you, and also I'll also educate so that you do learn and go. I mean, Christians ought to know a little bit. If someone says, where'd your Bible come from? You don't want to say, it came from heaven. No, it didn't. I mean, but some people say that. Some people, they've never, I'm not making fun, they've never learned in their entire lives how it was formed. And I want Christians to grow up and say, this is where our Bible comes from. It comes from a whole bunch of manuscripts. Mostly, not all, mostly papyrus scrolls in pieces. Where'd those come from? Different parts of the Roman Empire. Where? Well, then, if they keep asking, you get specifics, or go back to your notes. But the manuscripts, why trust them? Because we have really old copies. That's the short answer, really old copies. How do you know that? Because we can study them and know where they come from. Well, there's tons of mistakes. Well, they're called variants. There are a lot of them. What's your point? Well, how trust it? Because almost all of those mistakes are spelling errors. We can correct them immediately. But over 99% are. There's about 0.5 that actually affect anything. You want to talk about those? Well, all of a sudden, those are those. And I've got a few more. There's about a dozen. You see, my point is, those are little nutshells of what I've done with people before. Well, then why trust any of it? Well, because it's very historically probable. We have evidence for it. Well, don't you just have to have faith? No, I don't. I've got to actually, we can go to the Library of Manchester or Cambridge and look at it. I can look at P52 and realize that came within a few decades. That's a living lifetime of a person who wrote the original gospel. That's nothing like that in the ancient world at all in the Western Hemisphere of the planet. Well, I don't trust it. That means you don't trust any literature for the ancient world. Is that right? So we know nothing about the Roman Caesars. We know nothing about the emperors or how Rome lived. Well, of course we do. No, you don't. Because you just got rid of everything that was ever written. And that's the only place we get it from, are Roman historians. Why throw the baby out of the bathwater? Well, because it's mythic. Oh, now we'll get internal data. Let's talk about myth. That's next week. Well, no, it's not mythic. Well, still, yeah, do you believe in Lord of the Rings came to life? Do you believe in Harry Potter? No, I don't. Well, that's what the Gospels. No, they're not. And I can prove it to you. That we're going to talk about that next week. But those are good questions. Is it like that? The answer is no, it is not, and I'll tell you why. I'll tell you exactly why.
I mean, I'm sure.
Well, you could believe that. I mean, you could say, no, God designed this and calls the errors, and that's the way it calls us to have faith and to struggle. I mean, you could make up all kinds of faith reasons. I just don't find that compelling, which is why it doesn't make it to my list. But I don't think we need to do that. I think we just if you were a Satan worshiper and looked at the same manuscript evidence, you go, no, this stuff is trustworthy. That's all. Correct. Bart Ehrman is a well-known textual critic scholar. Correct. I had no idea he was from Lawrence until like a few weeks ago.
Seems like such a minor thing to leave faith with, doesn't it?
Yes, ma'am. But well, for him, it was like the snowball effect. So for him, it was that. Then it was, all kinds of stuff, evil and suffering. But in all fairness, right? If you grow up, as a lot of people in America do, not all, but they grow up in a little more fundamentalists. A lot of them are Southern Baptist. And they're not all the same, but they grow up being taught very much from people they respect. They're preachers, they're teachers that say, every bit of this is inspired and inerrant. The originals, the copies, every bit, from the maps to the front, the maps in the back. I mean, and if it didn't happen just like this, then why trust any of it? And they're taught to believe that very much so. And so then when you learn that the copies weren't copied perfectly, I could see from his perspective, it created a crisis of faith. Like, well, because all of his life he's been told probably, why trust any of it if even one word wasn't inspired? And